guys, Wave Nunnally back with Bible Unplugged. Thank you for joining us again. We're back into our series on Back to Basics, and this is, believe it or not, our 8th episode in that series. In the previous 7 series, we talked about the problem between God and man and God's solution, and then how that solution, in terms of its application, actual walking it out, began to morph and change under the influence of really important people in the Hebrew Bible, like Samuel and Isaiah, the Psalmist, Jeremiah, Hosea, Malachi, all the way to the end of the Hebrew Bible. You have these guys who are starting to suggest that there is change in the mix and that a movement is underway in terms of the way that people understood the sacrificial system itself, moving from a literal and an animal sacrifice to things that could actually be substituted for that. Things like doing good deeds, obedience, prayer, body postures like the lifting up of hands in Psalm 141 and the like. And then we talked about, moved on into, this sets the stage for how to better understand the life and ministry and especially death of Jesus, and then of the sacrificial lives that followers of Jesus are supposed to adopt as a part of their commitment to following after their rabbi. And the last session, session number 7, what we did was we went all the way back to the beginning and connected the dots in the previous 6. So if you feel like this is too short of an intro for what we do today, please feel free to go back and to watch all the way through that last session that we did, where we connected all the dots and we've surveyed all of the previous 6 sessions. What I want to do today is I want to look at a question that just begs to be addressed, and that is, how would people like Samuel and the Psalmist, Isaiah, Malachi, Micah, how would these people ever expect to have their messages understood and then accepted by people that they are addressing? How would the Dead Sea community, the Essenes, the people who created the Dead Sea Scrolls, or people in places like in apocryphal material or pseudepigraphical material written between the Testaments, how would people like John the Baptist and Jesus and Paul, how would they have ever expected their message to gain traction and then acceptance by the general population when we consider that they are suggesting what we today would look at, from a long way off as being really radical, very revolutionary ideas that would in some way undermine 3 of the greatest institutions of Judaism. And by that, I'm talking about the temple and the priesthood and the sacrificial system. 3 integral institutions to the reality, the identity of Judaism. And so today, we're going to address the elephant in the room. We're going to ask the hard question. What made people think that it was even possible that there could be this kind of development and movement and progress applied to temple and priesthood and sacrificial system? What made this revolution possible? And I'm not just talking about New Testament revolution. I'm talking about what's going on with the rabbis and with the Dead Sea movement and other people, with folks even in the Hebrew Bible. So this is an important question. Let's address this, just breaking it down into those same 3 basic topics. We're going to talk about temple first. Later, we'll talk about priesthood and the sacrificial system. But why would people ever begin to question the appropriateness or the acceptability of what's going on in the temple itself? So I want you to look with me at some between the testaments, some intertestamental documentation from the Dead Sea Scrolls. First of all, the covenant of Damascus. Here we see they are profaning the temple because they don't observe the distinction between the clean and the unclean. And this is with respect to the teaching, the clear teaching as understood by that community of the Torah, the law of Moses itself. in one of the earliest commentaries, things written to explain Bible. In one of the earliest commentaries, it's called the Micah Pesher, or the Pesher on the book of Micah in the Old Testament. This is a Dead Sea word that is relatively unique. It simply means commentary, which we have in parentheses here. What is the high place of Judah? Is it not Jerusalem? Well, a high place is a place of idolatrous worship. And it's actually a quote from the book of Micah in the Hebrew Bible. But what these guys are doing is they're applying these words to the temple as it existed in their day, in the 2nd century BC, a couple of hundred years before Jesus would begin his ministry. Here's another passage in the Habakkuk Pesher, or commentary. All of this is from Cave 1 at Qumran. The condemned house, and remember that we have come to understand the word house as being code for temple. Like I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. The condemned temple, it's a city of vanity, and they're referring to Jerusalem. And they perform a service of vanity for the sake of its own glory. Now, this service is not just like changing the oil in your car. When a intertestamental source like this is talking about service, talking about temple service. Notice the connection to temple there. And not only are they talking about temple service, but primarily the actions of the priests as they engage in the sacrificial system. So this is definitely a commentary against the temple and what's going on in the temple. Josephus, a 1st century Jewish historian, contemporary of the apostles and the writing of the New Testament, is going to say this, that the Dead Sea community, they've stopped offering sacrifice in the temple. Instead, they employ a different ritual of purification. Because of this, they are barred from the precincts that are frequented by all of the people. So they perform rituals or rites by themselves, but alone, apart from the temple, the sacrificial system, and the priesthood. In fact, you have a Dead Sea scroll called 11Q Temple Scroll. And in these columns 13 through 40, a really lengthy chunk in a really large document, in the temple scroll, we hear a description of the end-time temple. They're talking about the removal of the temple as it existed in their day, 2 centuries before Jesus, John the Baptist, Paul, and the beginning of early Christianity. And they're saying that temple is so beyond repair, is so corrupt, that it's going to have to be done away with, and there's going to be a 3rd temple, not Solomon's, not the one they knew in their day, which was Ezra, Nehemiah, and then renewed by Herod the Great around the time of the beginning of the 1st century. What we've got here is a whole new, a 3rd temple, an end-time temple that they said would be rebuilt, would be built, and would replace the one that could not be fixed in their own day. That was still standing in their day. Well, the rabbis joined in this critique of the temple, and we're going to see some of that critique a little bit later when we're talking about sacrifices, the sacrificial system. When we move into the New Testament, we see that there are things going on in the life and ministry of people like Jesus and John the Baptist that perfectly mirror this critique, this current critique of the current temple that is going on in the centuries before Jesus and right at the time of Jesus. In the Gospel of Luke, we read that John the Baptist was growing and becoming strong in spirit. He lived in the deserts until the day of his appearance to Israel. You say, well, what's wrong with that? A lot of people like camping out. But this is more than that. John the Baptist was the son of 2 people, the father, Zechariah, the mother, Elizabeth, both of whom were descendants of Aaron. What that means is that John the Baptist was a priest. Where he should have been all this time was training for and then beginning ministry in the temple itself. the temple that Jesus, Paul, and other people knew in the New Testament times. And yet what's going on is he's AWOL. He's completely absent. He is missing in action. So evidently John the Baptist has an issue with what's going on in the temple and those running it. In the Gospel of John, and notice how early in the ministry of Jesus this takes place. Jesus comes into the temple and he finds people selling oxen, sheep, and doves, and money changers that are there. And money changers are moving the currency from what was modern and contemporary to the temple currency, which mean that they got to rip people off or to, skim off of the top in the money exchange and then charge more. Also jack up the price when their people are buying their sacrificial animals. And so Jesus made a scourge of cords. There's your meek, mild, lowly, peacenik Jesus. He made a scourge of cords and drove them out of the temple along with the sheep and the oxen. So John the Baptist has a problem with the temple. Evidently Jesus does too. Not only that, John chapter 2 at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, but Matthew 21 in the last week of Jesus' ministry, Jesus is continuing to have a problem with what's going on in the temple. In the last week of his life, it says he entered the temple and he cast out those that were buying and selling. Evidently, they'd reconstituted their businesses and their money-changing tables, and they're still doing the same thing, buying and selling in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. The end of this event in the last week of Jesus' life is that Jesus says, it's written, my house will be a house of prayer. And he's quoting Isaiah 56. Remember, he says, it is written. So that means he's going to quote from the Hebrew Bible. My house is supposed to be a house of prayer, Isaiah 56, but you're making it into a den of robbers. Well, that's not in Isaiah 56. So is Jesus just audibling off? Is this off the cuff, making it up as he goes along? Nope. We find that what he's doing is quoting another prophet. And this prophet is one who is busy predicting the destruction of the temple of Solomon, the temple that existed in Jeremiah's day. Jeremiah says, has this house, notice code for temple, has this temple called by my name become a den of robbers? There's the reference. And so Jesus is hypertexting. He is doing a footnote to Jeremiah chapter 7 and the language of Jeremiah 7. It's become a den of robbers. So like the Peshers from Qumran, like the Micah Pesher, he's saying this applies to the temple in my day. That old temple, the one from Solomon's day, that's gone. The Ezra-Nehemiah temple, rebuilt by Herod the Great, well, now that's standing, and it's following right along, following suit with the temple that Jeremiah predicted would be destroyed. Jeremiah says, my place, another nickname for the temple, which was in Shiloh, that's the tabernacle, where I made my name to dwell at first. See what I did to it. Go to Shiloh and take a look at the destruction that happened there, is what Jeremiah is saying. If Jesus is quoting Jeremiah, he's saying, look, the same thing is happening and the same result is going to take place. There's going to be a destruction. So Jesus has predicted the destruction of the temple, which happened in AD 70, in a code way by referring to this obscure passage in the prophecy of Jeremiah. Same problem, it's going to end in the same conclusion, the same result, destruction. So he poured out the coins of the money changers, he turned the table and he said, stop making my house a house of merchandise. There is evidently a problem in the temple, not only in the ancient sources surrounding the New Testament, but also in the New Testament itself. Let's move on to the priesthood. We're going to do priesthood and then we'll address sacrificial system. And in some measure, yes, you're exactly right as you're thinking through this. All of these are interconnected. We'll connect the dots at the end. In the Tosefta, very early rabbinic literature, we hear this about the priests. Why was Shiloh destroyed? Oh, wow, we've just caught the ancient sages of Judaism, the early rabbis, discussing the same thing that Jesus is dealing with, and they're referring back to that passage in Jeremiah chapter 7. On what account was Shiloh destroyed? Well, it was because of the disgraceful treatment of the holy things that were there. But as to the latter house, again, code for the second temple, Ezra and Nehemiah refurbished by Herod. On what account did they go into exile? Because they loved money and they hated one another. Oh, so there are personal problems. There's a love of money and a hatred issue going on. Among whom? The leadership of the temple. The rabbis will continue. The second temple was destroyed. Here's another reason. Because they, the priesthood, bought the high priesthood with money. So now we've got an extortion thing going on. We've got some sort of purchase of the power to control the temple itself. Here's another text. Woe unto me because of the house of Boethus, which no one knows from the New Testament, but from extra-biblical, outside the Bible, this Boethus founded a dynasty of leaders who became priests and members of the Sadducean movement, the Sadducees. Woe unto me because of their sticks, their walking sticks, their staves. Woe unto me because of the house of Hanin in Hebrew, which translates into New Testament reality as a reference to Annas, the high priest. You'll remember Annas. Annas was the guy whose home Jesus was taken to right after his arrest. Even before he got to Caiaphas and then eventually to Pilate, he's going to be taken first to the guy who's really the puppeteer, the one who's really calling the shots, the one who's really making the moves in the background, and that is Annas. He's the head of a high priestly dynasty. And he says, woe unto me because of their whisperings. Okay, so now there's also character assassination, and there's plots and all kinds of intrigue going on the part of the high priests. The passage continues, woe to me because of the house of Yishmael bin Fiabi, and we know who this guy is as well. He's another high priestly family. Woe to us because of their fists. So there's violence that's going on. They are high priests, and their sons are treasurers, and their sons-in-law are temple overseers. So now we have nepotism going on. We have a monopoly that's taking place, and these high priestly families have all of the bases covered, all of the power positions. Their sons are treasurers, their sons-in-law are temple overseers, and their servants, after all of this nepotism going on, their servants beat the people with sticks. It's like, what? We never read this in the Old Testament. That's because this is after the Old Testament. We never read this in the New Testament. That's because readers of the New Testament in the first century were assumed to know this kind of stuff. So what we have to do is read that ancient literature, the stuff's going on around the New Testament, to understand the context, the culture, the history, what's going on that the New Testament doesn't bother to inform us about because it assumes that we know the stuff. So now we're learning, we're becoming conversant in the stuff. Josephus says, and this is the question about the sticks, beating the people with sticks, and because of their fists. What's going on exactly with this among the priesthood? And Josephus, first century, contemporary of the New Testament, the apostles, it tells us, explains to us exactly what the rabbis were talking about the fist and the sticks and beating the people. Now, the high priest Ananias daily paid court with gifts to the procurator Albinus. He's one of the successors of Pontius Pilate. He's the Roman military governor over the province of Judea. Okay? He was paying court to him and bringing gifts to him. So this guy's involved in payoff schemes, and he is collaborating with the occupying force, the Romans. According to the rabbis, according to rabbinic literature, that was the unpardonable sin, was to collaborate with and turn fellow Jews over to the occupying force, whether that's Greeks, Romans, or whatever. But Ananias had servants, listen to this, who would go to the threshing floors, and they would take by force the tithes belonging to the priests, the common priest. Nor did they refrain from, listen to Josephus, first century source, nor did they refrain from beating those who refused to give up the tithe to the servants of the high priest, rather than giving the tithe to the common priest to which it was due. The chief priests were guilty of these same practices as Albinus' slaves, and no one could stop them. They were out of control and couldn't be reined in. So it happened at that time. Let's say, so what? Big deal. That was then, this is now. No, listen to this. The common priests who in older days were supported by those tithes were now starving to death. That's a big deal. Do you think that endeared the people to the high priests for behaving in this way? When the common priests, the ones who lived among the people, the ones who were responsible for teaching the people, training them in their faith, they are dying of starvation because of the behavior of the chief priests. You say, I know about those chief priests. I've read about those chief priests in the Bible. Okay, the next time you're following through and you're reading in the Gospels, etc., and you read this phrase right here, chief priests, factor all of this in and you understand some of their motivation, what made those guys tick, why they acted in certain ways in the New Testament. Here's a blown up picture of a weight used to measure, to weigh precious metals. And this was found in the priestly quarter of Jerusalem not terribly long ago. And there's an inscription on it in Hebrew. And it says, Beit Katros, the house of a high priest whose name was Kathros, that we know of from the literature of the early rabbis. So we've got a problem with the temple. We established that by looking at a number of texts, Dead Sea texts, as well as New Testament texts. We also now have just finished looking at passages that critique the high priesthood. They're buying their position for money. They're collaborating with the enemy. They are beating the people. They are extorting money by their control, their monopoly over the system that they had set up in the temple itself. So now let's look at this third thing, this third institution that seems to be being radicalized, kind of overthrown, for sure changed pretty radically, and that is the sacrificial system. You say, well, Moses set it up. He set it up 1,400 years before the time of Jesus. It had been running fine and fluidly for hundreds and hundreds of years. Centuries have gone on. Why in the world would anybody ever give up their belief in it has to happen just like this? How would Jesus ever come to see himself as the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world, or giving his life as a ransom for many, or his blood that's poured out for the forgiveness of sin? How do you get to that point? And that is exactly my point. We're addressing the elephant in the room. So let's address the third part of this elephant, the sacrificial system. In the rabbis, we hear this, and this is an event that takes place at the end of the 1st century BC. We're at the dawn of New Testament times. Jesus and John the Baptist had probably already been born when this event takes place. Now there was present a guy named Bava ben Buta. He was the main advisor to Herod the Great, which you know of from Matthew chapter 2 and the like. One time, he came into the courtyard of the temple and he found it desolate. There's nobody home, no one there. He's going, what in the world is going on? This is the temple. This is the house of God. He said, may the houses of those who desolated the house of our God, notice house is temple, the temple of our God, be made desolate themselves. May God desolate. He's standing in a long line of people like, and you can do this for homework, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Haggai, and the like, that use this same kind of language, that there's going to come a judgment that's going to result in the desolation of this place these people because of what they have done to the house temple. And so since we're talking about the sacrificial system, let's take a look at where this story goes in the next slide. So what did Bava ben Buta do, this chief advisor to Herod the Great? He went out and he bought the whole Kedar flock and he set them up right in the temple court. And he announced, whoever is required to bring whole burnt offerings and or peace offerings, let him come and take a beast and lay hands on it and then sacrifice. In other words, people were not coming to the temple. Why? Because the cost of a sacrificial animal had risen so high that it was exorbitant. The people were being extorted during their desire to approach God with sacrifice so that they could be renewed, restored, reconciled to God, forgiven of their sins. Bava ben Buta, the top guy in the rabbinic movement in the 1st century BC, is saying there is really something wrong here. We've got a major problem that has to be addressed. It is in that context that Jesus comes on the scene. And in John 2, at the beginning of his ministry, and we already looked at this passage, Jesus cleanses, that's the language we use, cleanses the temple. That means he had a problem with what was going on. He does it again in Matthew 21, and this is in the last week of his ministry. He, quote, cleanses the temple yet again. So is Jesus' cleansing of the temple a one-off? Is that just a total aberration of history? No one ever thought of this before. This is something where he maybe just got out of control. He had a bad day at the office that day or something, and he just kind of went bonkers in the temple. No, it is a part and parcel of how people were viewing temple and priesthood and sacrificial system. And Bava ben Buta had just done something along the same line. Instead of forcing people to buy overpriced animals from a monopoly where they had no choice, and their sacrifices that they brought from Galilee or from the Negev were being disqualified for all kinds of weird reasons. What does he do? He goes out and he buys sacrificial animals and gives them away to the people so that they can approach God, so they can worship, so they can be forgiven, so that they can be restored and reconciled. Jesus comes along and he sees there's a problem, and yes, it's with the sacrificial system, the same problem that Bava ben Buta had isolated. So here Jesus is acting on that in the same way, or in much the same way that Bava does. He is undermining the sacrificial system, not that Moses set up. It was in good shape. It ran for hundreds of years properly, but some kind of way it had gotten hijacked more recently, and Bava is addressing it, and Jesus is addressing it. And now let's look at one last example. After Jesus' time, but not long after, because the temple is still standing. So this is pre-AD 70. And it is after Jesus, so it's like somewhere after AD 30. So we got a 40-year time period that this could have happened. But look at who's involved in this. This is Shimon Bin Gamliel. And we know who Gamaliel was. He was the aged teacher of Paul. Okay? Shimon is his son. Remember Osama bin Laden? Okay, so Shimon Bin Gamliel is Gamaliel's son. That means he was a contemporary of Paul the Apostle, probably a study partner. At least he was a peer, a contemporary of Paul, where he and Paul were studying together with the father Gamaliel. So here's the story. One time in Jerusalem, there was a pair of turtle doves. This is the poor man's offering. Remember, it shows up in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 2. Joseph and Mary offer 2 turtle doves. A pair of turtle doves cost a golden dinar. I did the number crunching. It comes out to be $1,500. It's a month's pay for the average worker in the land of Israel in the 1st century. Try meshing that with your budget. $1,500 for a couple of turtle doves. Rabban Shimon Bin Gamliel, he enters the scene, and he says, by this temple, which is a swear formula, God is my witness, is what he's saying. I will not allow this night to pass by before they cost only 1 silver dinar, 1 day's pay, about $60. What does he do? Shimon Bin Gamliel, he goes into the temple court. This is what Bava Ben Buta did. This is what Jesus did at least twice and maybe more than that. He goes into the temple court and he taught, which is a technical term that means he sat down and gave a ruling. It involved the sacrificial system and it lowered the demand or something going on within the sacrificial system. And it says that same day, the price of those same 2 turtle doves stood at 1/4 of a dinar, which is about $15, a reduction of by 99% in 1 day's time, the cost of this poor man's sacrifice, the pair of turtle doves. Shimon Bin Gamliel, just a few years after Jesus' ministry, also recognized there's a major problem going on with the sacrificial system. But not the sacrificial system itself, those running the sacrificial system, the people who are setting the prices, the people who are gouging the common folks who come from all over the world to sacrifice. They have the monopoly, they're the ones in control, and they are lining their own pockets at the expense of people who came to worship God, people who came to get right with God. People who came to get forgiven and get reconciled with their God. What an abuse of position. What an abuse of power. What an abuse of their God-given responsibility to be mediators, to connect people back to God. Are there corollaries in our world today? I don't know. Yeah. How much time have you got? How much paper do you have to make a long list? There's all kinds of abuse on the part of religious systems that are in place and that are entrenched and that are only sandbagging their own position and aggrandizing themselves and building their own kingdoms in this earth. That's not to be the case on the part of those who represent God and who are supposed to be serving God and helping people to a closer relationship to Him. That's one takeaway. That's an obvious one, right? Another one is how important is knowing the background, knowing the context, understanding what is going on in the time of Jesus, in the time of the New Testament, during the not-so-silent years between Malachi and Matthew. It's incredibly important. It helps us to set the stage, to understand why Jesus would say certain things, do certain things. It helps us to understand why people in Jesus' day would readily accept, as they did, the prophets and the psalmist, those people in the intertestamental period who are saying, you know what, there's a big problem on the Temple Mount. You know what, there's a huge problem with the sacrificial system. And guess what's wrong? It's not the temple, it's an inanimate object. It's not the sacrificial system. It was good the way that Moses set it up in the Torah. The problem is the people who are running these two things, the temple and the sacrificial system. The priesthood is thoroughly corrupt, and they are interested only in their own profit. They are monopolizing, they are abusing people in the process, and these things have to be addressed. So people are going to accept, you know what? There's another way of thinking about this business of the presence of God among His people. There's another way of thinking about this business of priesthood and how we should all be priests and we should all be representing God. Those guys sure aren't, not properly. And in terms of a sacrificial system, may the lifting up of my hands be like the offering of the evening sacrifice. That makes sense from Psalm 141. God has commanded that a temple of human beings be built so that they might offer up, like the smoke of incense, obedience to God's word. That's what we get from Qumran. Jesus comes along, Paul comes along, we are the temple. We are the priests, and we are to be living our lives not like those guys, but sacrificially giving our lives out on behalf of others, on behalf of our service to God. This, I hope, has really brought all of this home that we've been studying for these last 8 weeks now. And I really hope that your reading of the New Testament, your understanding is going to explode in terms of the depth and appreciation that you have for the way that Jesus, Paul, John the Baptist, the way they were living their lives within this context and addressing what were current and very real issues in their day. And those issues are so poignant, they're so powerful that they still speak to us today. God bless you as you pursue Him in the Word. God bless your reading and study of the Scriptures. I pray, I trust that the time we've spent together in this series will have moved that forward in a significant way. And I'm trusting that this is going to get under your skin, even more so into your heart, and that it's going to enable you to more effectively serve God and represent Him out there in your world. God bless you richly. We'll see you in the next segment.